Greetings. In this video, we will take a look at the difference between shadows in Maya software rendering and Arnold rendering. Maya software is a little more appropriate for graphics and illustration, whereas Arnold will give us photorealistic shadows. We've got just a basic sphere on a plane, and I've created a single spotlight. Note that we can come up to the light bulb to turn on the lights, and then right next to that is shadows. Now, you know that if we're in Maya software and we hit render, we won't see the shadow. That is because with Maya software, the light that we created, in this case a spotlight, if we come down, it is by default on with ray trace shadows. If we look in the render settings under the Maya software tab and we scroll down to ray tracing is deselected by default. So that can be a little confusing. That's why I'm reminding us. And so if we click that, now we could see that will render. Now my quality settings are very low, so we're getting some aliasing here. So let's just set that up to production. But the shadow is what I'm interested in demonstrating here. It's just a hard shadow all the way around. Now, let's go back. I'm going to deselect ray trace shadows on the light. And let's just take a quick look at the depth map shadows to review. We'll render that. Even though I've turned on ray tracing, depth map will work. That is the default, most inexpensive in terms of processing power. Is the depth map shadow. Now you can see the quality is not very good. We could turn up the resolution, but if we wanted to soften the shadow, we would turn up the filter size, let's say to 5, and render that. And we get a soft shadow, but if you look at shadows in reality, the further away from the source of the shadow, the softer it gets. So if this was a real sphere sitting on a real ground plane and we were looking at it with a single spotlight, the shadow would be tight here and it would get softer the further away from the source that it got. So this isn't photoreal, but most people won't notice that. And if we're creating, as I mentioned a moment ago, graphics or illustration, a lot of the times in graphics and illustration, you'll have a hard shadow. And you won't have quite as much gradation around a volume or an object. It's much more flat by comparison to reality. And that's an aesthetic decision. You may have an assignment that is illustration style or graphic style, and then the Maya software rendering will be a good option for you. So this is depth map. We softened the shadow. We did that by adding the filter size, bumping that up a little bit. Let's leave depth map shadows for now. Depth map shadows, Maya software. Let's come down to ray trace shadows. I'm going to save this one just so we can compare later on. And so now we're rendering. We've got ray tracing on. We've got ray tracing on in the render settings, and we'll hit it. And we've got that hard edge all the way around, even though we're ray tracing, and ray tracing is a quality shadow. One fundamental difference just here at the beginning, ray trace shadows will cast through transparent surfaces. Depth map shadows cannot cast through transparent surfaces. So there's one difference in Maya software, depth map shadows versus ray trace shadows. Now, in order to soften that, when we were using the depth map, we increased the filter size. Here we want to increase the radius. The greater the radius, the softer that edge will be. And we'll see that with ray trace shadows, we get that realistic softening as the shadow lengthens. So we could increase that. Let's just jump up to a healthy number 4. And then the rays, you can think of it like quality. So I'm going to increase that to 40. So this is softening it, and this is increasing the quality of the shadow. And you can experiment with lower numbers to see what happens. But as we render now, so we see the soft shadow, and it's a little bit tighter at the beginning, and it's softening as it gets further away. So this is a much more realistic shadow according to the way that light would actually move through the scene and the way that the shadow would be cast. So we can get some realistic ray trace shadows, increasing the radius to 4 and the shadow rays to 40. Now I'm going to save this, and we'll take a look at the difference between this render and an Arnold render, which is the best quality of photorealism is what you're after. Again, it depends on what you're after. Are you after a graphics type of illustration representation of your modeled render, or are you after photorealistic light and shadow? So it's not right or wrong, it's just what you're interested in producing. So let's switch over to Arnold. Now, the first time we do this, if we come to Arnold Render and we go to render it, it renders black. It's not technically black, it's just dark. The Arnold is rendering with a quadratic decay. That is, the further away from the light source, the drop off is exponential, or squared, I think. And so we need to bump up the intensity. Now let's select our spotlight. And if we come to the top, here's the intensity. So talking about bumping up the intensity, you might assume that it's there. And you could bump it up and that would work. But let's skip down to Arnold. We're going to leave that the same. The only thing I changed here was the Penumbra is bumped up. But let's come down to Arnold. And here's exposure. And the exposure is set to 0. And that's a multiplier for the light's native intensity. I should pause here to mention Arnold will render Maya lights, not the ambient, but the directional spot and area light. I don't know why that escaped me. The directional point light, spotlight, and area light will all render in Arnold, not the ambient though. But there are Arnold lights too. Now Arnold lights will not render with the Maya software, but those 4 Maya lights will render in Arnold. So you can play with your Maya lights and know that if you want to switch over to Arnold, they will still work. But you would have to come and do something similar to what we're doing here, turning up the exposure to about 10. Now let's render this, just all default. We'll hit render. And we're back to that hard shadow. If we were to go back and let me save this and kind of take a look, you're getting much better color. As I mentioned, graphics kind of are much more flat versus a photograph, and so those kind of flat approaches are aesthetically appropriate if that's the style that's called for your particular task. But if we look here, there's a little bit more subtlety to the gradation, and I don't know if you can see that via the YouTube video, but on your own screen you should be able to see the quality of the Arnold render. Now we're back to that hard shadow. How do we affect that? Well, we have the radius. On the spotlight, it is radius. If we were looking at a directional light to soften, that would be the angle. But if we take this to 3 and render it, you see we're getting that softness. Now, there is some noise in here, and I don't know if you can see that through YouTube, zooming in. And that's because it needs to have its quality bumped up. The more rays, the higher the quality that we'll need. So we'll come to samples, and 8 is probably more than enough. And we'll render that. And so here we have the same objects rendered with Arnold. We came down in the Arnold tab of the spotlight and we turned the exposure up to 10. Our samples are 8. That may have been a little bit high. And then our radius was 3, which gave us that soft. If I cranked up the radius even more, that shadow would be even softer as it fell off. But you can see that gives us a nice photoreal look. Now, with just a basic sphere and a basic plane, we're probably not getting the full difference that you'll get. But that's part of this week's project. We're going to create some basic primitives, basic colors, But when we render it in Arnold, we'll get a really photoreal feel to the images. And that's part of the reason that I've selected the particular inspiration project for this week. Just some basic polygonal, really primitive objects lit well and Arnold Render, and you'll have some dynamic images. And if you do some custom versions, you could really have some strong pieces for your portfolio. Okay, questions in the forum.